Thank you, Nikki, for organizing this. It's wonderful to have so many people here at Rice University discussing this. It's really, it's terrific that you've put all this together. It's very exciting, and I'm very honored to be here just merely introducing people. It's great. So first, okay. So in this session, we will have 2 talks back to back. I will introduce one and then the other. Each will speak for, I think, roughly 30 minutes, and then the rest of the time will be for Q&A. So to begin, we have Judith Revel, who is professor of contemporary French philosophy at Paris 1 and a member of the Institut Universitaire de France. She is also president of the Scientific Council of the IMEC, and her work focuses on representations of history and contemporary thought and on the historicity of philosophical objects and categories. And so please welcome her, and her talk is entitled A Philosophy About the Present, a Philosophy for the Present. Welcome.
So, yeah. First of all, I'd like to thank Nikki for the wonderful welcome she has given us and for the amazing organization of this conference. And we all knew that she was a remarkable scholar, and we know now she's also a tireless promoter of scientific events. So a huge thank you to everyone here in Rice University, and once again, thank you, Nikki. And also, I'd like to apologize for my English, which is especially French. As you know, some French people are not very good at languages, but COVID has managed to make them even worse. So I'm both ashamed and resigned. There is a certain paradox in posing the question of the present, not only as a general topic, but as a concept in relation to Michel Foucault thought. And on the one hand, as you will recall, in the last years of his work, the philosopher multiplied his comings and goings with the systems of thought that have never been further away. It's no longer just the 17th, 18th, or 19th century, but the ancient Greek and Roman worlds. But on the other hand, the word present and its appearance synonym, which is precisely not synonymous, the word actuality, actualité, appear insistently. Elsewhere, I have tried to show how Foucault reference to the present actually covers what we might more simply call the set of determinations that characterize the moment in which we found ourselves. That is also the set of determinations that run through us and make us what we are. And in the same way, I've shown how reference to actuality was, on the contrary, a way of indicating the possibility of a shift, a rupture, a transformation outside the present, what Foucault elliptically called at the end a possible difference, une différence possible. That's not what I'd like to talk about today. Rather, my question in this brief intervention is the astonishing relevance for us today of a question that Foucault himself asked, and which has recently been given a new lease of life for reasons I'll get to into a moment if I have time, but Frédéric in a certain way already spoke about this morning. It's a very simple question. How do you talk about your own time? More to the point, how do you talk about your own time if you are a philosopher? What are the conditions for this practice of reflexivity, which considers its own situation as its object, and which can only do so by including the subject of knowledge in the situation it must account for? In preparing this talk, I was reminded of a detail from Borges' famous Chinese encyclopedia, quoted by Foucault at the beginning of The Order of Things. If you remember, among the categories of animals making up the encyclopedia and indicated by letters, there was, at letter H, the category I quote, included in the present classification, end of quote. The logical twist was clear and made Foucault laugh, because you can't be both the part and the whole of the segment at the same time. And yet this torsion is not dissimilar to the problem we face when seeking to constitute as an object of exteriority and analysis a context that is a historical moment in which we ourselves find immersed, the part or the whole. Well, there are several problems behind all this, which I'd like to formulate before recalling the way in which Foucault confronted them, also before saying 40 years after Foucault's death, why this seems to me to be absolutely important for us today. The epistemological, ethical, and political dimensions here seem totally intertwined, and that's what makes the question so interesting. The first problem is clearly epistemological. Sociologists and historians solved it a long time ago, but philosophers are still sometimes troubled by it. It concerns both the presence of the investigator in the field of his inquiry, that is, the impossibility of assuming a position of overview, and the fact that the outside of this field, what I have just called the overview, le surplomb, does not actually exist. Philosophers have long acted as if they didn't belong to their own picture of thought, as if exteriority were the hallmark of their status. This was Foucault's reproach against the classical philosophical subject from Descartes to the phenomenology, de Descartes à la phénoménologie. A subject that claimed to be self-instituted, independent of any historical determination. If Foucault finally wrote a history of the birth of the human sciences, if he had to archaeologically go back to the moment of their emergence, it's because with the turn of the 18th century, what was being put in place and what was to obsess Foucault for a long time was what he called the doublé empirico-transcendental, the doublet empirical transcendent. I don't know how it's translated in English. To say that the human is both subject and object of his knowledge is not only to say that he's on both sides of the constitution of the knowledge of the human sciences, but that he's doubly affected by historical determinations, both as object and as subject. He's therefore always inside history, inside the relations of power, inside a general economy of discourse that is specific to a given moment, inside a system of partage, partitions, inside the rationality of government, and so on. Inside, there is no possible outside. Does it mean we have to give up any scientific dimension? We know the answer given in reality very early in the German sociology. Max Weber comes to mind, and before Weber, that of Dilthey, and the precious distinction between the science of the spirit, that is the historical sciences, and the sciences of nature. The singularity of what Dilthey calls human social historical reality is not a concession that invalidates their scientificity. It simply makes them something else. Foucault's progressive development of all these elements would take time. In the 60s, the temptation of the outside, we spoke about it this morning, was still too strong. The balance is therefore between a model à la bataille or à la Blanchot, which seems to remain attached to the idea of an outside, and the will to historicize without rest. The recent publication of the unpublished manuscript, Le Discours philosophique, is in a way the most blatant proof of the moment when Foucault abandons the outside. After having spoken about it, the text of Blanchot, La pensée du dehors, is from 1966. But precisely the same year, Le discours philosophique tries something totally different. Not only we have to make the archaeology of the birth of the human sciences, as in Les mots et les choses, but we can also make the history of philosophical discourse itself. Better, the history of this specific philosophical discourse, which is the history of philosophy. In short, the history of philosophy. The philosopher is included in his own regime of historicity. He's not only the one who speaks of historicity, he's also, as a subject and as a subject of knowledge, within what he shows and analyzes. Second point, if nothing escapes history, if discourses and practices, if objects and subjects are historically determined, must we renounce truth? This is Foucault's burning question in his first lectures at the Collège de France since 1971, a very Nietzschean question, of course, but also a question which is epistemologically the effect of Foucault's gesture of radical historicization. Can we make a history of truth without a concept of truth, without a clear criterion of truth, Foucault asks. And his answer is straightforward. Yes, it will be a history of historical partitions of truth and falsehood, of what he calls game of truth, in the same way that Wittgenstein spoke about language games. Even today, Foucault's detractors point to his relativism, and I refer to the analysis of Frédéric this morning, his nihilism, his guilty responsibility for the erasure of ethical values or for threatening the unalienable truth of philosophy, which should be one and the same. They affirm the radical separation of philosophy and history. Philosophical truth cannot be historical. But then again, for Foucault, there is no eternity, only historical processes of constitution. History, whether past, present, or yet to come, always presents itself in four overlapping modalities: phenomena of permanency, phenomena of disappearance, phenomena of emergence, phenomena of transformation. The thickness of history is this complexity, and history of truth is simply a history of how these four modalities are distributed among themselves at a given moment. Third point, what are we to make of all this? In the 60s, Foucault does what Western historiography has always done. He distances himself from the past in order to be able to talk about it. Writing history means, in a way, carefully distinguishing it from the present. The archaeological method in the first books attempts an operation that exclusively concerns the past. Usually Foucault involves differentiation between two regimes of representation or thought that he carefully keeps at a distance from his own horizon of thought. But he soon realizes that this kind of tightness doesn't work. The one who speaks has to be somewhere in the picture. Where does he fit in? This, for example, was Michel de Certeau's great reproach at the time of the publication of Les mots et les choses. And Foucault himself must have realized this, since the very famous end of the book alludes to the actuality of the configuration the book has just described. And precisely for that reason, also to its possible disappearance. Anything that has historically emerged may one day historically disappear. At the very beginning of the 70s, Foucault makes a double gesture. First, he includes himself in his own description. Two examples of this in very different contexts. On the one hand, the famous conversation with Gilles Deleuze on the status of intellectuals. It's no longer a question of being universal intellectuals à la Sartre. That is, intellectuals unaffected by the historical, social, and political determinations on which they nonetheless express judgments. On the contrary, there are specific intellectuals, intellectual specific, situated as they are from the standpoint of knowledge, from the social and political situation and the historical determinations that are theirs. It's this situation so different from the Sartrean concept of situation that makes the intellectual specific. It is not the contingency of freedom, Sartre. Rather, it is a recognition of a position and the decision to invest that position, not to regard it as a limitation, but to transform it into a precious store for the critique. It's easy to see how a certain epistemology of situated knowledge from Donna Haraway to Sandra Harding has taken up exactly this thread by denouncing the God trick, I'm quoting Haraway, embodied in limitless objectivity, but without ever renouncing situated objectivity. And by avoiding the risk of essentializing points of view, precisely thanks to their historicization. But Foucault makes also a second gesture, which is precisely the extension of his analysis about the past towards his own present. This is not to say that the philosopher Foucault and the activist Foucault are finally joined, but that the doubling of archaeology by genealogy provokes a kind of rebound. The analysis of history is precisely what makes it possible to open up the most difficult of fields, the analysis of the present as such. The propedeutic to the preparatory moment of any analysis of the present remains history, including in its most material aspects. I'm thinking here of the possible political uses of archive. But it is only by working on past systems of thought that we can grasp our own system of thought. How can we produce a critique of contemporary economy of desire, for example, if we don't go through a careful analysis of an ancient regime of pleasures? How can we grasp the neoliberal rationality of government that claims to manage our behaviors if we don't understand what it was at its liberal roots, also how and why it has been transformed? How can we grasp the face of contemporary Homo economicus if we don't understand the different face he had at the very beginning of the 19th century, etc., etc. Last point and a short final remark. The present, as I've just said, imposes itself on the basis of a differentiation. It means that it becomes visible from what it no longer is, from what he differs from. In his later years, however, Foucault will bring this differentiation into play, not behind the present in relation to the past, but ahead in relation to a future, to what is not yet, but could be the famous and fascinating différence possible, possible difference. The question of the present is largely requalified by this kind of displacement It is now the question of the constitution of the invention, the creation, the institution, who says most of the time, the production of new forms of subjectivity. It is also the call of new modes of life. And it is finally bound up with the strange thing that Foucault would first experiment with concretely forms before finding a conceptual formulation for it, which is the question of revolution. Of course, the Iranian experience has been a cruel episode, cruel above all for the Iranian men and women. Nevertheless, the question remains, and it's an essential one. How can tomorrow not resemble today? The importance of the problem can be seen in the two commentaries in 1983 and 1984 on Kant's What is Enlightenment, Was ist Aufklärung, to which Foucault adds, not by chance, in the second commentary, another Kantian text, but a post-revolutionary one, the conflict of the faculties, as an answer. Revolution is virtuality in history, which means within the historical mesh, there is always the possibility of bifurcations, twists, transformations, because there is always the possibility of an invention, of a production. Within the meshes of power, we find the unconditional inventiveness of men and women. This is certainly what we need to remember today as we live in such a dark and sometimes despairing world. The meshes of power are particularly tight and suffocating. They are also unevenly distributed, and this inequality in itself is monstrous. But they never cancel out our power, ethical, political, to invent, that is to produce not in an economical meaning. It's not about being optimistic, it's about being courageous and determined. My final remark concerns the analysis proposed some 20 years ago, maybe more, by an otherwise remarkable French historian, François Hartog, of what François Hartog identified as contemporary presentism, the, I quote Hartog, presentism of the present, which is characterized by, says Hartog, a kind of thrashing of the dimensions of history on the one hand, and of the future on the other, onto the present moment in itself. According to Hartog, the contemporary world has lost the shores of the past because it has distanced itself from the great philosophies of history while claiming to think about the past from its own situation. And it has also lost the ability to imagine a different future because any imagination of the future is enslaved to a kind of a generalized principle of responsibility, which constantly reduces our capacity for invention to an assessment of the risks to our own time. Without history and without a project, or rather having absorbed the past and the future, the presentism would get bogged down in its own consistency, becoming what Hartog calls the monstrous present. It seems to me that Foucault is the exact opposite of this analysis. There is no present without a diagnosis of our own historical condition, but this can only be achieved by differentiation from the past, from past configurations, which we must first and foremost describe, analyze, and understand. But there is also no present that does not call ahead of itself for the ethical and political experimentation of a difference. That is, the courage of an invention. Once again, the invention is the present emerging from itself. It's an ever-present bifurcation. It's the displacement of the lines. It's more concretely the way in which men and women not only resist, but produce milestones, fragments, essays, attempts, or what Foucault beautifully referred to, la vie autre, a different life.